Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the latest live episode of the Free Marketeers podcast. Today, we're talking about a relatively big event that happened in the last week. It actually happened yesterday for those of you who weren't following the news, either watching TV or maybe watching and following online. We had the latest budget speech by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. So today, we're going to analyze that. And to do that, I have the great privilege of being joined by Mr. Ray Mahlaka from the Daily Maverick. Ray, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Chris, for having me. It's lovely to be here.
So, Ray, did Minister Mboweni solve all of our financial woes, our financial problems? Did he wave a magic wand? We have a presentation from you and a few slides that we're going to show in a bit, but I thought we'd get your sort of introductory thoughts and remarks, and then we can dive into the details.
Yeah, I think we were speaking before we went on air. He was doing the best, out of a very difficult situation, that is. And I think overall it was a good, a good budget. He stood firm in many areas that will make him unpopular with his ANC colleagues and Labour, affiliation partners as well. But I think, overall he managed to really hold the line, in the face of a very difficult situation and declining public finances and a very a fiscal space that isn't as large, and he doesn't have room to experiment with the budget. So I think it's one of the best budgets we've seen in recent years, Chris. I'm willing to say that and go that far. Eh?
That is quite the hot take. I was wondering what hot takes you were going to give us. So there's the first one for the day. I'm going to have like a counter that I'll have on the sides. I'm just going to share my screen now and go into your presentation. So you just tell me as we sort of go through to click through, and then we'll go from there, I think.
Sure.
Okay, I think we're ready.
Yeah, so I thought maybe this is a good place to start on, because I'm a journalist. I'm a financial business journalist, and I thought maybe let me take the audience in how my thinking is when I go read budget documents or when I review, the budget every February, the midterm budget in October. So these are the things that I look out for as a journalist. I look out for economic growth forecasts. Now, this one is important because it informs the ability of South Africa to create jobs, and it also informs the ability of the government to generate revenue from taxes, taxing you and I, South Africans. And this one is important because, we know the story of South Africa. Economic growth is declining, is in the doldrums. In 2020, we don't have the figures yet for 2020, but we know that the economy will decline to an unprecedented level of between 7 and 8%. Then in 2021 and 2022, we'll see growth come in, but it'll still be an uneven growth. The next thing I look out for is, the government's expenditure pattern. Is the government embarking on additional expenditure, meaning blowing the budget and spending more money, or embarking on austerity? That means cutting spending and cutting, line items in the budget and cutting crucial service delivery programs. Now, just a forewarning, Tito Mboweni hates the word austerity. If you want to offend him, call any budget an austerity budget, and he will trash you publicly. And the next
he was very focused on that. Sorry to interrupt you, but he did bring that up quite a lot yesterday. I'm like, Minister, are you overcompensating for something, or?
But you know what? We'll get into. Let me preface this. I do believe that there are some elements of austerity in this budget, and I will explain later which parts I think make a strong argument for an austerity budget. The next is South Africa's debt profile. Interest on debt alone is spiraling out of control, and it is crowding out government's expenditure and spending as well. Just the interest alone on our debt is about 300 billion rand. That is more than what we spend on social grants annually, that is. So that is quite scary. And this one is a bit emotional for me because I feel like our current debt levels, we're going to be saddling future generations with this enormous amount of debt. And of course, the last point I look out for as a journalist reading budget documents is additional and new tax measures. And the February budget is very special because it's the budget where the government can introduce new tax measures. So if it wants to raise additional government revenue, it can, put in place new personal income tax measures. So the February budget is the budget for additional tax measures. Can we go to the next slide, Chris? So I want to start with the good. Let's cushion, the blow first with a bit of good news. We know that this is the year after the vaccine, and in fact, the rollout of vaccines has been dubbed as a stimulus for the economy. In fact, the faster and wider South Africa can get COVID-19 vaccines to the wider public, or 40 million adults, the faster the economy can grow, because there won't be a need for lockdowns and further restrictions on, the economy and the movement of people as well. Of course, the headline-grabbing figure or item emerging from the budget is that the corporate tax rate will be cut by 1 percentage point, not this year, but in 2022. I don't know why Tito waited for 2022. And of course, the withdrawal of tax increases worth 40 billion rand over the next 4 years. This was announced at the medium-term budget policy statement in October, but the government has had a change of heart, because it goes back to my next point. Economic growth projections have improved in 2021 and 2022, and tax collection trends have also improved. So the government has recorded a better than expected revenue from income tax, corporate taxes as well. So people are filing for and declaring their income to SARS. So that's why the government withdrew those tax proposals worth 40 billion rand. The next slide, Chris.
Ray, sorry, before we go to the next one, I wanted to ask you, and you can choose to sort of project on this or not, up to you. But, in the last year or so, we've had here and there talk about a tax revolt. So do you think the fact that tax collection has improved, does that sort of put pay to the idea that there could be this quote unquote tax revolt brewing?
Yeah, there's different ways to answer that.
Okay.
The first, you can't avoid paying tax. I mean, well, you can, but I don't think you want SARS as an enemy. But what we see is SARS can do more damage to you than the prosecution authorities, because they know how much money you generate, how much money goes into your bank account and leaves your bank account. But we are now starting to see an efficient SARS emerging. Right. A SARS that is now is really becoming diligent on compliance as well by citizens and people. So is there a tax revolt? I don't think so, because even if you do embark on a tax revolt, we now have a much more efficient SARS that is able to hunt you down and make sure that you pay your taxes on time. As well, the tax revenue base has improved, because many sectors of the economy have largely opened up, and a lot of people are back at work and able to generate income. So overall, you are seeing a good climate for compliance and disclosure when it comes to taxes as well.
Okay.
So still good. We're talking about government debt. That's expected to stabilize at 88% of GDP in the next 4 years, compared with previous estimates of about 95%. My favorite one, Tito Mboweni held the line on the 3-year wage freezes for public servants. We'll get into that later on. And speaking about SARS, Chris, 3 billion rand was awarded to SARS to boost its investigative capacity and ability to detect non-compliance. SARS has launched a new unit that is dedicated on high net worth individuals and making sure that they don't move their funds offshore and declare how much money they make. So that's a good thing. And also, an efficient SARS is important right now, because the government lost a lot of money when it comes to taxes from alcohol and cigarette sales because of lockdown rules. I mean, the illicit economy gained a huge market share during the lockdown. So we are now starting to see a SARS that is efficient and is able to go after errant, people who don't pay tax. And again, I repeat, the outlook for revenue collection and economic outlook has improved, and it means that The government won't be, raising money through the bond market, because if the government wants to raise money, as it has done over the past year, it has, basically issued, bonds and invited investors to buy its bonds or debt, and that's how it raises money. But we are seeing a government that will not tap the bond market, by huge amounts to raise money for service delivery programs, for example. The next slide, Chris. The bad aspect. I feel like a Debbie Downer here, Chris. But the budget, as I prefaced earlier on, it does feel like an austerity budget. I mean, government expenditure will grow by an annual average rate of 0.4% over the next 3 years. Mm-hmm. Budgets in health and social development, have been cut, and we know that these are crucial service delivery programs that are in these departments. So it does feel like an austerity budget when crucial service delivery programs are being cut, and also government expenditure is not growing, at a huge rate, because governments around the world are blowing budgets. They're spending. The pandemic has pushed governments, around the world to spend more to respond to the pandemic. But in South Africa, it seems like we're going the opposite direction. So I think that's quite worrying. Another worrying part is that social grants won't rise in line with inflation for the first time, I think, in decades. I don't remember, social grants not rising in line with inflation for as long as I've been a journalist, for about 10 years. And I thought about this, Chris, and I'd like to hear your opinion. I just wonder, will this go down well politically in an election year? Because we know that in every election cycle and every election year, we tend to see populist like proposals from the government. So the government will top up social grants by a large amount because it's good for electioneering and good for elections. So I just wonder, if politically this will go down very well. I don't think so. And Tito Mboweni said something in a post-budget speech conference with journalists. He said, there is no social contract to increase social grants. I think this is worrying because COVID-19 has created a social and humanitarian crisis, which requires the government to provide more support to people who cannot afford, to survive. And we know that, you can see the social grant system as either a success or failure. The success being that, you have the sophisticated program that is able to support people who are on the margins and fringes and who are vulnerable and cannot get an entry point into the labor market. But on the other hand, it creates a dependency by the people on the state. But there is a greater requirement for the government to support people and help them during this humanitarian crisis. But I mean, just to top up social grants and grow them in line with inflation, it will take about 4 billion rand or more every month to adjust social grants in line with inflation. The government says it doesn't have that kind of money. I'm not so sure about that when we're spending a lot of money on SOEs, but we'll get there shortly. The next slide, Chris. Now, as I said, the corporate tax rate will be cut. But at 28% currently and moving into 27% next year, it is still high because, the case against having such a high corporate tax rate is that, it discourages investment. It discourages investors from investing money in South Africa. I mean, why would investors invest in South Africa when they can go to Mauritius or Bulgaria or Malta or the islands where, tax rates are quite low. But at 28%, going on 27%, the tax rate is still high. I know the Davis Tax Committee did a lot of work around the corporate tax rates, and it actually suggested that the tax rate should be reduced to boost investment as well. But and also corporate tax cuts are counterproductive when other areas of tax are increasing, I believe. So we saw the increase in excise tax on alcohol and cigarettes increase by 8%. So on the one hand, you're cutting corporate tax, but corporate tax is supposed to boost investments by the private sector. And on the other hand, you raise taxes for the alcohol and tobacco industry at a time when both industries are on their knees and still reeling from the bans on cigarette sales. So I don't know what SARS is trying to achieve there when you're trying to cut one but raise the other. Again, I'm worried about there's been no further adjustments on broader personal income tax. There was no adjustments to dividends tax, so that's the amount of tax you pay on dividends as an investor. Capital gains tax on share sales, that didn't change. So you could argue that the government didn't go far enough, when it comes to taxes. Government guarantees to SOEs. Government guarantees, first of all, is when basically the government agrees with lenders that it will fork out, or it will step in when SOEs default on debt payments. It offers, lenders such as commercial banks a security, basically, that it gives to lenders if they borrow money to SOEs. Then the government offers that assurance that if an SOE fails to pay down that debt, then the government or the taxpayer, you and I, will step in and pay for that. But government guarantees will rise to 581 billion rand by the end of March, with Eskom taking a huge lion's share of those government guarantees of about 77%. I'm disappointed that there's still no mention about how Eskom's debt will be restructured. Eskom has a huge debt pile that's still, there's still questions outstanding about how this debt will be addressed. And SAA wants an additional 3.5 billion rand, from the government for its business rescue process. This is over and above, 16.4 billion rand that SAA received from the government for its business rescue process. I'm nearly done. Chris, the next slide. And the debt situation as well. Debt, government debt remains stubbornly high. Here's a worrying stat. Government debt will rise from 3.9 trillion rand last year in 2020 to 5 trillion rand essentially over the next 2 years. And as I said, debt service costs, including interest on debt, is sitting at 338 billion rand. That's quite staggering. As I noted in the presentation, this is more than the spend on social grants. Next slide, Chris. And I'm nearly done. The public sector wage bill. So the government most of the government's efforts to cut spending relies on cutting the public sector wage bill. This is how much the government pays public servants such as state-employed teachers, nurses, doctors. The government this year will pay 650.4 billion rand to compensate public servants. This eats up about 32% of government expenditure. This is the single largest component of government expenditure. This is quite staggering. But we are paying this amount for 1.2 million public servants, which is just 1.2 or 1% of the population. I don't know how we can justify these kind of payments to such a small portion of the population. And a surprising element that has emerged in the budget is that Mboweni wants to go ahead with the retrenchment of public servants and proposing that some public servants actually accept early retirement packages. Mboweni wants to reduce the headcount in the state by 0.8% this year. He also wants to freeze non-critical posts, as well as defer the payments of employment benefits such as housing allowance and medical, aid benefits as well. So there is a case to say, the public service is bloated, and one place to cut, as some experts have suggested, is look at the defense department. Apparently, that's where most of where the state can cut, because a lot of our defense personnel is now reaching retirement age. So if you want to cut the public sector wage bill, start there by pruning the numbers down in our defense department. So this is all I have to say for this morning. And be kind with your questions, please.
Thanks, Ray. As always, I think a lot to unpack from any given budget, whether it's the main one of the year, whether it's the medium-term one.
Yeah.
It's always quite something to watch the finance minister of the day try and balance all these things, try and how they all come with their different sort of personalities and styles, and how they try and handle the controversial topics. So a few things I just wanted to touch on and highlight and get your views on. The public sector wage bill, and that was your last sort of main point in your presentation, and the amount we spend on the wages. Why do you think that has sort of grown so much? Is that because the state thinks it should be the main quote unquote job creator or employer? Is that too simplistic an answer? Why do you think that's such a big item?
Yeah, to answer that question, we're going to have to go back to 2008 and how the government negotiates salary increases with trade unions representing public servants. So back in 2018, not 2008, the government prefers to enter in what we call a multi-year wage agreement. So this is a wage agreement over several years, and this helps the government anticipate the liability and how much it will have to fork out over a 3-year, a 5-year period when it comes to salaries for public servants. You could argue that that's a bad approach, first of all, to be locked into these 3-year, 5-year agreements. In fact, back in 2018, the government wanted to enter into a 5-year wage agreement with trade unions, but it actually settled for a 3-year wage agreement. But a multi-year agreement basically locks the government into unsustainable, and unrealistic salary increases for public servants. And that's the reason why the government, is in a bind right now, and it finds itself, challenging trade unions in court. So I think it boils down to the government. You could argue that the government is a bad negotiator, and at the time did not know how to negotiate with trade unions. You could also bring patronage elements as well to this discussion, because we know the events of the last 10 years and what state capture has meant for the economy. So did the government, enter into unsustainable wage agreements, as a patronage system to appease Labour, which is a huge constituency for the ANC, especially around election time? So you could venture into those arguments, Chris, but I'm inclined to lean into the argument that government is a bad negotiator, because it should be reviewing every year and have the flexibility and freedom to every year to renegotiate payment terms of public servants.
The final question I had on the public sector wage bill: what is the next thing that we, that viewers, that listeners should look out for in the next few months? What will indicate in what direction this broad issue is going?
So first of all, it's a political matter, and it's a legal matter as well. So political matter is that the unions are incensed about Mboweni digging in his heels and saying that there will be a wage freeze over the next 3 years. I don't know what the political fallout will be from that. But also there is a legal matter, to this conundrum, because the reason why Mboweni is so confident and has come out swinging when it comes to the wage bill is that the Labour Appeal Court last year gave him a huge victory, which said that the government does not have to award public servants increases in April last year of between 4.4% and 5.4%, depending on which level public servants are employed. So Mboweni is already boosted by that judgment and already has the court backing to not implement salary increases. But we know that trade unions have vowed to fight this. They have petitioned the Constitutional Court, where they say that the judgment by the Labour Appeal Court was procedurally unfair, because the 3-year wage agreement is like a contract. It is binding on the state, and the state cannot renege on the terms and conditions of the wage agreement. So what's going to be argued at the Concourt is terms of a contractual agreement. But the Concourt might not even entertain labor, because the court is yet to give access to labor or to hear the matter, or and also hear the matter by labor. So definitely that's one to watch at the Constitutional Court. It will also test the government's ability and freedom to determine wage agreements going forward, and it's going to be precedent setting going forward.
I'm hearing some sirens in the background, so I apologize if anyone can hear those, but hopefully they're not too loud. The question of personal income tax, and a term that was thrown around that I'd like you to explain, is quote-unquote bracket creep, and what that means. That personal income taxes weren't increased, and then I hear bracket creep, and when I hear the word creep, I assume it's either something is increasing. Surely the creep connotation isn't necessarily a positive one. So what does that mean?
So there's a group of people who won't basically pay income tax. They'll move into another higher or lower bracket that doesn't qualify them to pay tax, basically. So what it does, the simple way to explain it is it allows some group of people to not pay tax because they fall under an income threshold that doesn't allow people to pay tax because they don't earn a lot of money. So in a way, it's a system to hand back money to people and give them a bit of breathing room to not pay tax. So that's quite good, for the consumer, that is. So I think that was the only income tax measure that was announced yesterday, hey? If memory serves. That's about it, yeah.
Something that I might have missed, but that the minister might have covered and you would have picked up on, was something that has been discussed the last year or so, and that some people have been very concerned about, is that notion of prescribed assets. Did the minister mention anything in the budget on that point? Is it section 28, I think? Is there any sort of update around that matter?
Yeah, I didn't pick up anything, Chris, on prescribed assets. Or Regulation 28 amendments, which will make pension funds basically force them to dedicate a portion of pension savings to government-led projects. But anyway, pension funds, I don't think that there has to be regulation change, because the government is embarking on, an infrastructure build program where pension funds have volunteered to support and fund infrastructure projects that the government has identified. So I think right now it'll be left to pension funds basically to have the discretion on basically investing in government-led projects right now.
I want to see those brochures for government-led infrastructure drives and see how they try and convince the given pension fund to invest in that. One thing I wanted to highlight, you talked about austerity, and part of me, it might be a bit sensationalist or radical, but a part of this budget feels quite anti-lower to middle income class, sort of anti-poor. And the reason I say that, and I want to highlight, is the increase on the fuel levy. And for many people, they haven't had a choice during the last year. They've had to work from home because of the pandemic, so it's not like they had a choice. But for many South Africans, those who still have jobs, they have to travel to them, and not in their own cars. They have to take taxis or public transport, that the few trains that are still running and the few buses. So increasing the fuel levy increases the cost of, for example, taking a taxi. That, all these taxes are eventually passed on to consumers.
Yeah.
Was it really necessary to increase the fuel levy? I know that some of it also goes to the road accident fund, that there are also issues around that, and corruption, and is it used correctly, and all of that. But what do you think on the fuel levy point?
Yeah. So I mean, a lot of tax practitioners would argue that, raising tax is unpopular for the government. It doesn't land well for the government, whether raising any kind of tax. But
regardless.
If you notice the tax trends in South Africa, the fuel levy has been the one tax that has been increasing steadily over the past few years. I get the sense that it is an easy target for the government to target, because politically, it's raising the fuel levy is much more acceptable than raising VAT, or embarking on a wealth tax, as I said, or raising corporate taxes as well. So I share your sentiments, Chris. I mean, unfortunately, the fuel levy, it filters down to everything. It filters down to, the price of a taxi fare. It filters down to the price of food. It really filters. It has so many tentacles into the economy that at the end of the day, it will bite the most vulnerable, citizens in the country. Vulnerable citizens who won't even get, increases or large increases in their social grants as well. So my view is that, targeting the fuel levy is much more easy and politically acceptable than raising VAT, which I think the country would burn, and also income tax. We tax to the hilt. As South Africans, if you're lucky to have a job in South Africa, imagine if personal income tax had increased yesterday. I think there would be a revolt, Chris, using that word you used earlier on. Hey?
Ray, I wanted to ask you about ratings agencies and whether you think, it's difficult for us to, at any time, put ourselves in the shoes of another human being, another individual, but do you think they will be broadly happy with the latest budget? I know that the bar was quite low. Last year we were downgraded again. But do you think the rating agencies will think, okay, at least the South African government is somewhat pointing in the right direction? It's not making this radical progress, but I don't think anyone should have expected overnight that government was going to cut spending by 70% and cut salaries and privatize Eskom. So one has to also operate, I guess, within the real world, quote unquote.
Yeah. I think, rating agencies will be happy on the fiscal consolidation side of the budget. So we're talking about, credit rating agencies have been exasperated trying to urge government to cut spending, cut debt, keep a lid on ballooning debt. But it seems like, Mboweni is sort of, heeding the call of rating agencies. So on the one hand, I think rating agencies will be pleased when it comes to the fiscal consolidation space, fiscal consolidation budget, rather, that Mboweni has outlined yesterday. Where credit rating agencies are going to be disappointed is the speed at which the government is moving with structural reforms. The government is very slow on moving with structural reforms. This week, we know that ICASA will delay the auction of radio frequency spectrum by a month. That process is supposed to, I think, be concluded at the end of March this year. But ICASA, which is the regulator in South Africa, still has to appoint an auctioneer, an independent and external auctioneer. You can't make this up, to be honest. ICASA has to appoint an auctioneer that will lead the process of auctioning spectrum. We haven't released new spectrum in about a decade. And on the easy win of structural reforms, the allocation of spectrum is easy. On the energy side, there is a bit of movement when it comes to launching a bid process to procure, I think it's bid window 5, to procure energy from independent power producers. There is a bit of movement, but one would have loved to see a bit of faster movement there. Also, the process to split Eskom into 3 parts. We've been talking ad nauseum about this, Chris. You had Andre de Ruyter quite recently, and the deadlines have been pushed to December 2021. Others have been pushed to next year as well. So where credit rating agencies are not going to be happy is on the structural reforms front. But the fact that Mboweni is really talking tough on the wage bill, I think that will definitely appease it'll appease credit rating agencies who have lost patience with South Africa over many years as well.
Just on the SOEs, you mentioned obviously in your presentation on ESCOM, we didn't have mention of NHI, which I do consider a type of SOE. One item that was mentioned was the land bank, and that, is effectively, I'm putting words in the minister's mouth, but it's effectively getting a bailout. Have you done any research and digging into the land bank and its current sort of state? We know that land reform is a big priority for the government, and there's always a lot of talk about it. But then when you look at the line items, land reform and agriculture spend isn't necessarily always the top priority. Like money goes to SAA, it goes to ESCOM. For a government that says land reform is a big priority, the most money doesn't always go to it. So what's your take on the land bank at the moment?
Yeah. So, I think we know that Mboweni doesn't like processing bailouts to unproductive state-owned entities. But Mboweni has a soft spot for the land bank. In fact, he used the words, the land bank is too big to fail, because the land bank is a substantial lender to the agricultural sector. In fact, it holds about 28% of South Africa's agricultural debt. So it's quite a substantial debt provider to farmers, established and emerging farmers as well. The land bank, to be very short about the problems at the land bank, up until I think 2011, the land bank was highly profitable. The land bank was actually one of the state-owned entities that didn't rely on government guarantees and government equity injections or bailouts, as we know it. It didn't receive that kind of support from the government up until 2011. Then you could argue that the Treasury, which oversees the operations of the land bank, dropped the ball, because the Treasury's focus was on other SOEs that were struggling, such as SAA, ESCOM, but it didn't have a strong oversight role on the land bank. And the land bank started giving credit out to farmers at a rapid rate, and farmers are now starting to default on those loan payments. And that's why you see the land bank finding itself in this conundrum where it is facing financial losses of more than 2 billion rand. It has defaulted on debt payments to lenders, and the land bank is on the verge of collapse without government support. But we know that Tito Mboweni came to the land bank's rescue by giving the bank a bailout of 7 billion rand over a 3-year period, which will be released in 3 tranches. So 5 billion rand for this financial year, 2021. Then the remaining 2 billion rand will be released in 1 billion rand tranches over the next 3 years. So the land bank, Tito Mboweni likes the land bank, and that's why it was the only SOE that managed to get a bailout from Mboweni. But again, the land bank, South Africa's food security system is heavily tied on the land bank. And I cannot imagine what a collapse of the land bank could mean for South Africa's food security system and support to farmers, right now. So, like Tito, I also like the land bank like Tito, so I'm copping out to that.
I have a few more questions for you and things I would want to get your take on that we can better understand it. So the first one was just on the vaccine rollout program. That was obviously the first thing that you mentioned, and that Minister Mboweni highlighted the 9 billion. Do you know, is any of that funding from the Solidarity Fund, from the medical aids? Is that simply from the government and then we'll get supplementary funding from the medical aids? You could argue, you can throw 60 billion rand at this thing, and just because the South African state is administering it doesn't mean it's going to be effective. To vaccinate 40 million South Africans by the end of this year, I think would be the most ambitious and greatest accomplishment ever. As a classical liberal, if the government managed that, I'll be like, well, hats off. The South African state has achieved this massive goal. So just your thoughts and a little bit of details and analysis on the vaccine rollout.
So the 9 billion rand will definitely come from the fiscus, so public funds. So I know the government has set aside an additional 9 billion rand, bringing the cost to about 18 billion rand to fund the vaccine rollout program. because I think it's going to be a very complex and highly involved function, as you said, Chris, to roll out vaccines to the wider public. But the initial 9 billion rand is coming from public finances. Then the additional 9 billion rand that can be freed up later down the line, it comes from what we call contingency reserves. So this is basically funds that the government saves for emergencies, for unexpected events, and risky events. So the pandemic would be considered as a high risk event. So Chris, you and I, the South African taxpayer, is funding the vaccine, and the government is leaning towards a free rollout of the vaccine. So you and I won't be paying for it. That's how I understand the government's approach to be when it comes to the rollout of the vaccine. It's going to be free, and it's going to be fully funded by the government from public finances.
A big thing with South Africa's budget always in discussions and analysis is the debt and the debt servicing costs. You also highlighted that in passing on these costs to future generations. So this is an unfair question and a sort of a thumbs up question, but is there a way to quantify or understand, for example, how much one's children or grandchildren in 10 or 20 years will have to pay towards servicing South Africa's debt? Is there a way to look at, per citizen, this much is going to have to go to paying off the debt at the rate at which it's growing? And, there could be progress in terms of arresting that rapid growth. I think a few months ago, we said we'd hit 100% debt to GDP ratio by 2023. So maybe it'll be a bit later. But just your thoughts on the sort of future debt and future generations.
Yeah, this is quite a worrying one, Chris, because, at 5 trillion rand debt for the country in the next 3 years, that is more than 2 times what we spend every year on government expenditure. So our debt levels is much higher than our expenditure levels, and definitely the future generation will be paying dearly for the current generation's decisions when it comes to raising debt. But can I offer you good news, Chris? Because I feel like this conversation is heavy and negative as well. With your permission, do you want good news?
I think we're always waiting for lights at the end of the tunnel. So even if the light isn't even at the end of the tunnel, but here on the side of the tunnel where we are, please, whatever you can provide.
So 2 things on debt. As I said, when the government wants to raise money, it issues bonds or government debt in the market, and our bond market is very liquid. It's able to attract investors who still believe in South Africa's potential and risk profile as well. So our bond market is well supported. Because economic growth is expected to come back over the next few years, and that tax revenue collection has improved, we will start to see a government that won't issue a lot of bonds in the market to raise money. So the government will be relying less on the bond market going forward, to raise money. I think the issuing of bonds, I saw from Intellidex yesterday, they estimate that the issue of bonds will fall next year, basically by R1 billion or so. So that's quite a good thing, that the government won't be raising more debt and increasing the debt profile of the country. Another good thing is that if you look at the composition of our debt, we've got foreign denominated or foreign currency denominated debt, that is debt in foreign currency, and we've got debt that is denominated in local currency and the rand. A big portion of our debt is still rand based and not dollar based. So by that score, it means that South Africa will be able. It helps South Africa to basically pay back debt and be able to service that debt when it becomes due. Because one scenario you don't want, like a Zambia or Argentina, they had a lot of their debt that was in foreign currency, and that makes it much more expensive to pay back debt and much more costly to pay debt. So the good news is that our debt is still local currency based, and that the government, because of economic growth projections and because of tax revenue collections, it won't approach the bond market as much to raise debt. So those are the two pieces of good news I'm leaving you with, at least on the debt side.
Just a few more questions from my side, and then we'll wrap up. The excise duties on alcohol and tobacco products being increased. You mentioned the illicit market, and there you have the problem of government, maybe inadvertently, some would say deliberately, helped stimulate the illicit market. So now it'll be difficult to get those consumers who have now established those networks and been used to getting their products in those markets, get them back into the legal markets and paying those excise duties. So just because you increase the excise duty doesn't mean people are going to consume less of the given product,
Yeah.
So what do you think this will accomplish? Will the government be able to collect more revenue from those products, or do you think that ship has really left the harbor, as it were?
Yeah. In fact, I thought it was laughable in the budget when Mboweni said, there's excessive consumption of alcohol and cigarettes, and raising the excise tax on alcohol and cigarettes will deter alcohol and cigarette consumption. I don't know what world he's living in, because South Africans like to drink, but I feel like, Chris, and I'm going to say something very controversial, I feel like you are seeing the alcohol industry being unfairly targeted here again. You had the government targeting alcohol during the lockdown. Sure, it did help alleviate pressure in the health system, but there's some arguments about whether keeping it as long as we have, is there any benefit that we've derived from banning the sales of alcohol? But to your question, I think the ship has probably sailed, because alcohol manufacturers and cigarette manufacturers are trying to claw back, lost legal sales, from the third ban on alcohol and cigarette sales since March last year. So I'm in two minds, Chris. I'm in two minds. I think both industries are on their knees, and it'll take probably a long time for them to recover. And also, the alcohol industry is forging ahead with this court case against the government about the ban on alcohol sales. So that'll provide much more clarity going forward whether the ban was illegal or illegal in the first place. But I think the alcohol industry is trying to cover itself for future bans and future losses as well that might be incurred from bans as well. So I think the horse is bolted. There's a lot of money that was funneled out of the system. And also remember, Chris, we can't buy alcohol on weekends. How many people are buying alcohol illegally on weekends as well? So money is still being lost, in the fiscus over bans.
One thing I was very happy not to hear about was something that I saw talked about in some media outlets recently, was around looking at increasing taxes and really cracking down on that sort of idea on the informal sector and the informal economy. So I pray and I hope that for as long as possible that sort of thing doesn't happen. I mean, to think about just how resilient the informal sector is and how it employs people, and people can be active and stuff. Just because someone is selling fruits, on the side of the road that the government hasn't given a permit for, doesn't mean it's somehow less legitimate or less like morally, weighty kind of thing. So I'm glad that for now, at least, that wasn't mentioned. But knowing this government, it'll probably come soon. My next question for you is on projected GDP growth, and I know this is also difficult to say, but we had earlier this week, was it this week? The weeks go by so quickly now, but earlier this week we had the latest unemployment numbers. I think on the expanded definition, we're now on 42.6%, 11.1 million people unemployed. To make any dent in that, you probably need 5 to 7% growth for every year for the next 5 years, kind of thing. Does anything in this budget indicate to you that we're heading on that trajectory? I know you touched on the structural reform, and we've got the promises, we've got the grand plans, we've got the smart cities. When are we going to get this growth that we need to make a dent in those kinds of numbers?
Chris, the unemployment crisis, I don't like calling it a problem because a problem tends to glaze over the seriousness of this problem. It's a crisis. I'm surprised the streets are not burning every single day with a 40% plus unofficial, unemployment rate. But the unemployment problem, it goes beyond an economic growth problem. It touches on education and having a skilled and educated population, basically. If we are cutting budgets, Chris, I know education, thank God education, was not touched in the budget. There was no cuts in the education budgets at all. But it goes back to what you said. Economic growth alone will not help in creating jobs. We need to fundamentally look at how we educate, the public at a basic education level, at a tertiary level. And also, let's face it, we are an anti-entrepreneurship country from a public policy perspective. So many red tapes, so many barriers to entrepreneurs to start their own businesses, let alone getting a business registered in this country. You're going to have to jump a lot of hoops, Chris. But the unemployment issue is not just about economic growth. It's also about education as well. To touch on what you said, to make a dent into the unemployment rate, we need growth of about 4% at least. So it means that we're going to have to go back to 2008 levels when the economy was growing at 4%. We had a budget surplus of 1%. I think that was during the Trevor Manuel years as well. So we need that kind of level of growth. We need structural reforms urgently to create jobs. But the tone of the government, I don't think it's quite serious on creating jobs because it seems like it's shooting itself in the foot when it comes to spectrum, releasing radio frequency spectrum. And it's also about the quality of jobs as well, Chris. I fear that if people are getting an entry point into the labor market, the quality of jobs is not great. It's not long-term jobs. It is, contractual jobs for a short period. Then individuals find themselves unemployed later. So this is, I don't know, this is a very complex, situation and question, but definitely I think that should be the priority right now, creating jobs and empowering people, to know how it feels to be able to generate an income and get a salary in South Africa, because many people don't, and many people will never experience that privilege, Chris.
Yeah, politicians of all stripes, bureaucrats, presidents, deputy presidents, everyone talks about dignity and agency. But at the end of the day, we have all these barriers to employment where we presume to tell people what they should be doing or how they should be living. And at the end of the day, we have over 11 million people without a job. So at some point, you have to question the rhetoric and what, the loftiest and noblest words aren't necessarily going to actually deliver the kind of change that you need. My final question and point that I just had for you, on which we will wrap up, was around the social grants and welfare and a safety net. So at the moment we have 18.2 million people receiving government non-contributory social assistance, and you talked about this huge issue of now effective cuts to social welfare. And despite the minister saying repeatedly this is not an austerity budget, it probably is.
It is.
But I want our focus not just to be on the last year and the damage caused by COVID-19, but what I think, and from the FMF's perspective, this is the result of years of wrong spending and wrong priorities. And, for example, giving billions to failed SOEs. Last year, we saw no serious cuts to cabinet salaries, for example, which would have been, talk about us being a team in South Africa and social solidarity. It always falls on the citizens. And as always, the greatest burden falls on poor citizens. There's never like sacrifices and team play from cabinet ministers kind of thing. So on the social grant point, if you were, for example, the president or the minister of enterprises, where would you cut on some of the SOEs, where would you make changes so you could keep the social grants going?
Yeah. I mean, with 700, I think the number is 700 SOEs, Chris, that we have in South Africa. 700. And I know that the Department of Public Enterprises is doing the work to pare down the number of SOEs that the government owns. But here's a scary statistic. Over the past decade, South Africa has spent nearly 60 billion rand just propping up SAA. 60 billion rand over the past decade coming to the rescue of SAA. The amount of money we spent on Eskom, I don't have the figure at the top of my head, but I'm sure it's as equally scary, if not more. So there's been so much wastage. There's been so much unproductive spend, as you know, at a government level, especially when it comes to SOEs. Let's not forget also, state capture is a cancer. It steals from the poor, and we're now seeing basically the result of, you know, highly sophisticated corruption and how the state was repurposed and how we had a shadow state within a state. Corruption steals from the poor. So there's money lost, trillions. I'm not going to audit how much money state capture cost the fiscus, but apparently it's more than $1 trillion. So all of this wastage, Chris, imagine the potential of investing in improving the quality of life of citizens. Investing in people, making sure that people are skilled enough to enter the labor market, you know, ensure that, you know, government talks about industrialization, big factories. I mean, that's good. We should be heading there. But, you know, imagine how much support we could have given to small businesses right now during the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, at a time when, you know, businesses need the support. I mean, in the US, they're considering giving, you know, grants, large grants to small businesses that have been hit by, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, regular income checks or checks worth about $1,200 just to support people who are unemployed. Imagine that if we did not lose money to unproductive SOEs and corruption and wastage around there, how much support we could have given to people right now. And, you know, but it's not productive. The what if scenario is not productive. Here's the crisis right now we're facing, I guess. Eh?
Thanks, Ray. I think we've managed to cover the whole gambit of details, both within the budget and just coming out of it and the sort of implications thereof. I think in a nutshell, you know, some good points given the broader context, and one needs to analyze things within context. Things aren't just in a vacuum. You can say that, you know, it was the best that the government can do at this point. They've created many problems for themselves. It's not like they're at the whim of the forces of nature. A lot of this is of their own making, but maybe in some ways trying to right the ship and salvage things to some extent. And again, we have to hold them accountable, and we have to look at what they say and what they deliver. And as citizens, the power ultimately lies with us, and we have to use it through various methods, through journalism, through NGOs, civil engagement, elections, everything. This year we have local government elections, so it's up to us to also see how things shake out. So Ray, on that note, I wanted to thank you for all your insights and your analysis this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm very positive about the future. I try to inject a bit of optimism in every discussion. And it seems like the penny has finally dropped about our fiscal crisis. And it seems like Mboweni understands the crisis that we're facing and is saying good things. Now, I think we shouldn't drop the ball in monitoring his work and holding him accountable going forward. Eh?
Well, I wanted more hot takes from you, and there's a positive hot take from us on which to end. Viewers and listeners, once again, thank you for your time joining us once again this morning. We always really appreciate it. If you haven't yet, please leave a like on this video. Please also share it on your different social media platforms, and also subscribe to our channel. We greatly appreciate your support. You can find all our articles and press releases and submissions on www.freemarketfoundation.com. Please go check it out. We also have our annual fundraiser going on right now. If you're able to, please consider donating to the FMF and supporting us. You can also find Ray on Twitter. You can follow him there. I recommend reading his articles and his analysis in the Daily Maverick. He provides really useful commentary, I think, almost daily, I think, Ray, at this point. You're so productive. I always think I have to match your output, and then I think, maybe that's not attainable. But anyway, we will leave you to it. Have a good day forward and a good weekend, and we'll talk to you all again next week. For now, take care.